Subsequent guild. As Deputy Layround listened to the familiar voice on the phone, he clenched his cigar and gripped the telephone receiver tightly. "Are you sure about this, Dorothy?" he queried tensely. "Is Tommy not on a trip or something?" "You have to believe me, Lay," Mrs. Dorothy Ward, wife of a prominent Taylor County, Iowa, farmer, implored. "Tommy has never gone away without informing me of his plans in our entire married life." A mental image of his friend, Tommy Ward, flashed into Layround's mind. Tommy's well-tended acres in the Conway community and his attractive, well-groomed wife were the envy of his neighbors. The deputy and his wife had often visited the well-managed Ward home, noting the couple's devotion to each other and their son, Carol, serving in the armed forces. Tommy Ward had left home at 8 o'clock the previous night and hadn't returned, causing his wife to be frantic with worry. "Tell you what, Dorothy," Round said, "as soon as the sheriff comes in, I'll bring him out to the farm." "Please do that," the woman answered, adding tearfully, "and hurry." An hour later, Sheriff J.T. Carter entered the office, and Deputy Round briefed him on Mrs. Ward's call. "But it's not even 24 hours yet," Carter objected. "He'll likely show up with a hangover or some excuse about being stuck in the mud." Round shook his head, insisting, "You don't know Tommy Ward. And you haven't seen his wife. No man in his right senses would leave a woman like her, and Ward is as sharp as they come." Carter, thoughtful, agreed, "You sound like you really believe that." "I promised Dorothy we'd come out and talk with her," Round said. The sheriff suggested involving County Attorney Ralph Jones, anticipating legal assistance in resolving the matter. Later that afternoon, Sheriff Carter, Deputy Round, and County Attorney Jones arrived at the spacious farm outside Bedford. Mrs. Ward, visibly anxious, welcomed them at the door. "I'm glad you've come, Lay," she greeted Deputy Round. "I'm worried sick." After introductions, the three men followed Mrs. Ward into a neatly furnished living room. Sheriff Carter asked her to share the full story about her husband's departure the previous night. "Now," he began, "Lay tells me your husband left home last night at 8 o'clock. Do you know where he was going?" Mrs. Ward nervously twisted her handkerchief. "What I'm going to tell sounds a little silly," she began. "Somebody knocked on the door around 8 o'clock. Tommy went to see who it was. A moment later, he came back into the room and said he had to help pull somebody out of a mud hole. He got his coat and things, went out back, threw a big log chain in the back of his truck, and left." "And you don't know who came here or who he was supposed to help?" Carter questioned. The woman shook her head. "He didn't take time to tell me anything. Tommy was like that, always anxious to help someone in trouble." "But didn't you hear the person at the door?" the sheriff persisted. "Could you give me some idea of what the voice sounded like?" Mrs. Ward hesitated, glancing around, then answered, "To tell you the truth, Sheriff, I got the idea that it was Aaron Ryan at the door." "Who is Aaron Ryan? A friend of your husband's?" Carter inquired. "He's more of an acquaintance," the woman replied. "He lives near Bedford. Tommy has known him a long time." Sheriff Carter considered this information, asking, "Do you think someone invented this excuse to call your husband away from the house?" When the woman nodded, he continued, "But why? Does he have any enemies? Does he carry much money on him? Or do you think it was someone who wanted to steal his truck?" As the woman listened to Carter's questions, her face revealed a mix of emotions. It was evident that she was confused. Presently, she burst out, "I can't imagine what has happened, Sheriff. I didn't think Tommy had any enemies, but even a wife can't know for certain. He always had $20 or $30 in his billfold. And about the truck, your guess is as good as mine. It's gone, you know." Carter nodded. The theory of robbery wasn't far-fetched. As for personal enemies, that would require extensive investigation, given that Ward's wife could provide no leads in that direction. Attorney Jones spoke up, "If you'll give us the license number and description of your husband's truck, we can put it on the police broadcast at once," he suggested. Mrs. Ward nodded and rose. "I'll have to get the details from his desk." She left the room, returned a moment later, and handed Jones a slip of paper. Carter suggested, "Why not phone it in from here and save time?" Jones agreed and went to the telephone. The sheriff said to the woman, "Mind if we have a look around the place?" "Not at all," Mrs. Ward replied. "And I hope you find what's happened to Tommy." When Jones finished at the telephone, the three men went outside and started looking around. It was dark now, and they were forced to use flashlights as they made their tour of the numerous outbuildings. They didn't find anything until they reached the largest hay barn. There, Deputy Round stumbled in the entrance to the shed where Ward had kept his truck. He flashed his light on the object entangling his feet, an enormous log chain. It was dusty and bore no signs of having been used in the mud. Taking the chain with them, the men walked swiftly back to the house. "Is this the chain you told us about?" Carter asked crisply. Mrs. Ward gazed at the length of linked steel as if fascinated. Presently, she nodded. "That's it, the only one Tommy owns." "But if he took it along last night, how did it get back here?" the sheriff demanded. There was a frightened look in Dorothy Ward's lovely eyes. "That must mean, oh, I don't know what it means." "It means there's something very queer happening around here, Mrs. Ward," Carter said sternly. "Frankly, when we came out here tonight, I thought we were making a big to-do over nothing. Now I am not so sure." "You think something terrible has happened to Tommy?" she asked in a small voice. Carter deliberated over her question a moment. "Somebody went to great pains to bring that log chain back," he said presently. "And you can see for yourself that it hasn't any fresh mud on it. That means your husband didn't use it like he'd planned. And we've got to find out why." He paused a moment, then added, "Has anyone been here since your husband left?" "Gene Downer came by this morning to see Tommy," Mrs. Ward said. "But I'm sure he didn't bring the chain back." "How can you be sure of that?" Carter snapped. "He didn't go any further than the front yard," Mrs. Ward replied. "Surely I'd have seen him if he went sneaking back to the barn." "Maybe you would and maybe you wouldn't," Carter said. "Did your husband and Downer ever have any arguments about anything?" The woman shook her head. "Tommy didn't have any arguments with anyone," she said in a positive tone. The sheriff pigeonholed Downer's name to be later checked, however. Before the three men left the Ward farm, they looked over the personal effects of the missing man carefully. But they found nothing out of the ordinary. Ward's books were in order, and he had not been involved in any legal actions of any kind. There were no threatening letters or signs of enmity with anyone. Carter, Round, and Jones began a painstaking canvass of the homes near the Ward farm. Most of Ward's neighbors had already heard about his disappearance. They were deeply shocked. Men like Tommy Ward didn't just vanish into thin air, they insisted. The sheriff then started probing the domestic affairs of Tommy and Dorothy Ward. But this angle, too, ran into a dead end. The neighbors repeated what Round had already stated, that the couple were very devoted to each other and never had any trouble. None of the neighbors had seen Tommy Ward the previous night. The last time any of them had talked to him was 2 days previously. "We'd better check with Aaron Ryan right now," Carter said to the others as the trio started back toward Bedford. Jones nodded. "But if it were Ryan who called Ward out last night, do you think he'd be likely to admit it?" "If he had nothing to do with Ward's disappearance, he would," Carter replied. "But we'll have to talk to him anyway. If he sounds like he's lying, we can check on his whereabouts for the entire night." A half-hour later, the three men were talking to the farmer. Puzzlement was written on his plain face. "But I swear to you men I wasn't even near Tommy Ward's house last night," he protested. Carter decided to take a long shot in the dark. "What would you say if I told you your car was seen in that neighborhood yesterday?" Ryan looked startled, then soon regained his composure. "I drove past Ward's place, if that's what you mean," he replied. "But I didn't stop there. Besides, it was early afternoon." "Mind if we look at your car?" the sheriff asked. The farmer shook his head and led the way to his garage. "There it is," he said, pointing to a 1934 Ford sedan. "Help yourself." The three men examined the machine carefully. When Carter flashed his light on the wheels and underneath the car, he saw that both were heavily caked with mud. "How did you get out of the mud if Tommy Ward didn't tow you?" he asked pointedly. "I didn't get stuck, if that's what you mean," Ryan replied, his anger rising. "You know as well as I do that it's rained around here recently. In fact, it rained last night. And the county has a number of roads that still need improving a great deal." The sheriff then asked the man if he had any ideas about what had happened to Tommy Ward. Ryan laughed derisively. "Maybe you'd better ask one of Dorothy's boyfriends about that," he snapped. "Just what boyfriends?" Carter asked quickly. "Ever see her with men other than her husband? Got any proof that she ever stepped out on her husband?" Ryan was somewhat flustered by these questions. He started to hedge. "I didn't actually see anything," he finally admitted, then in a flurry of anger burst out, "But if she thinks she can accuse me of knowing where Tommy is, she's crazy." Struggling to curb his irritation, Carter explained exactly what Mrs. Ward had said about thinking she had heard Ryan's voice the night before. Then he started pinning the man down about his remark reflecting on Mrs. Ward. That didn't just pop into your head on the spur of the moment, he went on. And if you didn't see her out with other men, you must have heard something. The man hung his head. You're right. I've heard plenty, but nothing you can put your finger on. You can see for yourself how attractive she is. Probably some of these hellcats around the country trumped up that story on her. Maybe that's where I heard the rumor. The sheriff persisted in questioning the man but could get no further information out of him. Before he and his aides left, however, he said, as a matter of routine, "Ryan, you'd better tell us where you were yesterday from 8 o'clock on." The farmer's belligerent expression vanished. "That's easy," he said. "I got home about 5 o'clock and never got off the place after that. A couple of my neighbors came over around 7. Carter questioned members of Ryan's family and the neighbors he mentioned. They supported the man's statement to the very letter. It became increasingly obvious that Ryan was not the man Mrs. Ward had heard talking to her husband. The three men discussed the mystery further as they left Ryan's home. "Maybe the stranger is Gene Downer," Rounds suggested. "He was the only guy who called at the Ward farm today. Looks as if he'd be the only one who had an opportunity of slipping that log chain into the barn." "We'll talk to Downer soon enough," Carter replied. "But I'm more puzzled about why the log chain was brought back than how it was done. It doesn't make sense." Ward's disappearance doesn't make sense, either, but he's gone, and without a trace, Deputy Round reminded his superior. When the three men arrived at Downer's home, they learned he had gone to Bedford for the evening. Carter told the woman at the door to have him get in touch with the sheriff's office when he returned. The woman looked puzzled but agreed. Carter and his aides continued to check with Ward's relatives and friends until far into the night. But they learned absolutely nothing. Early next morning, two of his deputies walked excitedly into the sheriff's office. Their clothing and shoes were caked with dried mud. "What happened to you guys?" Carter asked. "Get stuck in a mud hole?" "Not exactly," one of the men replied. "We just got through pulling Tommy Ward's truck out of a muddy field." Carter straightened in his chair. "Let's have the details," he said tersely. "We spotted this truck just off the highway, about a mile from town," the deputy said. "It looked odd, sitting out there in a sea of mud. When we checked license numbers, we found it was Ward's pickup." "Where's the truck now?" "Outside. We were careful about driving it in, not ruining fingerprints and all that." Carter called in Deputy Round, and the two of them went outside and inspected the muddy machine. He looked for a log chain in the short bed. There was none. There were no bloodstains nor other indications of a fight. Exasperated, he turned to Deputy Round. "See that nobody touches this machine until we go over it more thoroughly." The deputy nodded, and Carter went back to his office and put in a call to the State Identification Bureau at Des Moines, asking that a fingerprint expert be sent over immediately. The bureau chief consented, and in less than an hour, an expert was dusting all possible surfaces and looking for clear latent prints. He spent a couple of hours on the truck, and when he finally packed up his kit, Carter said, "Well?" "Several good impressions on the door, the steering wheel, and the windshield," he said. "I don't know yet how they'll turn out. They might be of one man or a dozen. They probably belong to the owner." "You mean if anyone else had anything to do with Tommy Ward's disappearance he or she would probably wear gloves?" Carter questioned. "Exactly," the expert replied. "And what I found along with the fingerprints practically proves it." "What do you mean?" the sheriff asked tensely. "I found prints on all surfaces which could have been left there only by a piece of cloth or a pair of gloves," the man said. Promising to give an early report, the expert went back to Des Moines to photograph and classify the prints that he had lifted with cellophane tape from Ward's machine. Then Sheriff Carter and Deputy Round went back to the vicinity where the deputies had found Ward's truck stuck in the mud. They canvassed residents for several miles around in hopes of finding someone who had seen the truck being driven off the highway into the muddy field. They worked hard for several hours but had no luck. No one had seen or heard anything. When Carter got back to Bedford, Gene Downer was waiting for him in his office. "Heard you wanted to see me, Sheriff," he said. "That's right," Carter replied. "I guess you've heard by now that Tommy Ward is missing. His wife said you stopped by to see him yesterday?" "And that I did," Downer replied with a sharp tone. "He wasn't there, as you know. Any harm in my stopping?" "That remains to be seen," the sheriff retorted. "You didn't happen to return something you'd previously borrowed, did you?" Downer looked puzzled. "No. I wanted to see Tommy about some feed for my stock." "Just what did you think I'd borrowed?" "A log chain, maybe?" Carter said, and he watched Downer's reaction closely. The farmer shook his head. "I don't know anything about a log chain," Sheriff. But I'll be happy to do anything I can to help you find out what happened to Tommy Ward. Then you don't have any ideas about his disappearance? Not a single one, Downer replied emphatically. He was an honest, God-fearing, sober man who never looked at any women but his wife. There simply isn't any reason for him to disappear. Unless... Unless what? Unless he is a robbery victim. Carter nodded. We've thought of that too. And just as a matter of routine, I don't imagine you'd mind telling me just where you were on the night of November 4th, from 8 o'clock on? Not at all, Downer replied. And he proceeded to give Carter a detailed account of his movements on the night in question. The sheriff assigned lay round to check on it. The deputy soon returned with the report that Downer's statement had checked out okay. The news had broken in both daily and weekly newspapers by this time, and the entire county was buzzing with speculation over the mystery. Carter instructed his men to be on the alert for chance remarks that might serve as a lead. And he and Jones and Round kept up their relentless questioning of everyone even remotely connected with the missing man. He put Ward's description out over the police teletype and asked Iowa State Police to broadcast the particulars at regular intervals. Also, he sent wires to Ward's out-of-town relatives and friends in hopes of obtaining a clue to his whereabouts in that manner. Days passed, however, and not one of the many angles being worked bore fruit. Ward's disappearance had been thorough, indeed. As Carter and Round talked over the work they had accomplished to date, the sheriff said, if he's been kidnapped, his wife would have received ransom notes by now. Round nodded. What about the possibility of amnesia? He suggested. In that case, there's been plenty of time for us to find out about it, Carter replied. The way I see it, there's only one answer to the question of what's happened to Tommy Ward. You mean, murder? The sheriff nodded. I'm convinced of it. But there are no clues pointing to it, and not a shred of evidence, Round pointed out. Ward's murderer was indeed clever, the sheriff said. But he's bound to have made a mistake somewhere. First, we'll start looking for a body or some circumstance that might tell us what was done with the body. Carter planned his strategy with characteristic thoroughness. And during the next few days, dozens of men in organized posses and hundreds of Bedford citizens acting on their own swarmed over every nook and corner of Taylor County. But when they got through and pooled their results, Carter discovered that the gigantic effort had not turned up one clue or lead. In desperation, the sheriff called the State Police Bureau in Des Moines. I want one of your best men to work with me on the Ward case, he told the bureau chief. Early the next day, State Agent Gregson arrived in Bedford. After Carter had brought him up to date on the facts, the two of them, accompanied by Lay Round and Attorney Jones, drove back to the Ward farm and questioned the distracted Dorothy Ward. She, too, was now convinced that her husband was dead, but still, she could offer no possible suggestion as to a motive. This left the officers with only one possible theory. Whoever called Tommy Ward out that night of November 4th must have had robbery in mind, Carter said. Gregson nodded. He evidently thought Ward's billfold was as fat as his cattle. Then in a different tone, if you don't mind, I'd like to question Ward's neighbors again. They've had a little time to meditate since you made your last rounds, and they may recall something important. Carter agreed at once. He, Gregson, Round, and Jones began another canvass of the residents of Conway community. Hours passed, and results were disappointing. They still couldn't find anyone who had seen Tommy Ward any later than November 3rd, a full 24 hours before his disappearance. Just when they were about to give up and drive back to town, they did learn one meager fact from a farmer who lived near the spot where the Ward pickup truck had been found. I didn't see Mr. Ward, but I did see his truck on the night of November 4th, the man stated. Where was it? And what time did you see it? Carter asked eagerly. It was on the road near the place where your men found it, the witness replied. I not only saw the truck, but the coupe trailing close behind it. Could the coupe have been hitched to the truck with a log chain? Gregson broke in. The farmer shook his head. The truck wasn't towing the coupe, if that's what you mean. Looked to me more like it was arranged for the coupe to follow it. When the truck slowed up, the coupe would slow up. You get what I mean. As to the time, it was between 9 and 10 o'clock. I don't suppose you recognize the persons in either machine? The sheriff asked. The man shook his head. There was only the driver in each vehicle. It was too dark to see who they were. And I didn't particularly try. I recognized the truck as belonging to Mr. Ward and took it for granted he was driving it. Did the coupe mean anything in the mystifying puzzle of Ward's disappearance? The investigators decided that it did and began probing around for other clues pointing to a coupe in connection with Ward's still unknown fate. In this manner, They learned something else of seeming significance from one of Ward's nearest neighbors. He stated that he had noticed a strange coupe parked in a lane near the Ward home on several occasions. "When is the first time you noticed this particular car?" Carter asked. The man's answer jolted the investigators. 3 years ago, he replied. "You're certain the coupe you saw on the several occasions is the same one?" Gregson put in. "Positive," the man said firmly. "Not only did it park in the same place, but it always had the same parties in it, a man and a woman." "Any particular time of day it parked there?" The man nodded. "Nearly always early in the evening. Usually left around 9 or 10. "I don't suppose you recognize this man and woman in the coupe?" Carter questioned. The informant shook his head. "Never got that close. Figured it was none of my business what man and woman wanted to cuddle up in that lane. I've seen other cars parked there, and I wouldn't have remembered that particular coupe if I hadn't seen it so many times." The sheriff turned the man's statement over in his mind. It was obvious that the lane was being used as a rendezvous for lovers. And it was equally as clear that the parked coupe might have nothing to do with the coupe seen trailing Ward's pickup on the night of his disappearance. But on the other hand, there might be a connection, and the investigators could not afford to overlook the possibility. At Carter's request, the farmer guided the officers to the lane in question. They discovered it was on the Ward property. "I told Tommy about the cars being parked here at night," the farmer declared. "And more than once, I warned him he ought to investigate." "And how did Ward take your warnings?" Carter asked. "He just laughed," the farmer replied. "Said he didn't see any particular harm in letting boys and their girls do a little necking in his lane." Carter and his aides looked the terrain over carefully in hopes of discovering a clue, but their hopes soon faded. They found a woman's handkerchief and a number of footprints and tire prints. These items had no meaning, however, except to corroborate the farmer's statement about what the lane had been used for. The official party went on to the Ward farm. Here they observed that the lane could only be partially seen from the farm, due to a screening hedgerow. But this didn't further the investigation any. Mrs. Ward personally posted a reward of $200 for information concerning the fate of her husband, but as days passed, even the monetary reward failed to bring out any pertinent facts. Mrs. Ward became ill with anxiety and grief but continued to lend material aid to Carter and the assisting officers. If the sheriff had any doubts as to the woman's loyalty to her missing husband, her apparent grief and her ceaseless activity dispelled them. Although Aaron Ryan's alibi had cleared him completely, Carter and Gregson questioned him again in hopes he knew something significant. But this angle, too, fizzled out as rapidly as it was conceived. "However," said the sheriff as they rode away from the Ryan place for the last time, "I can't help but feel that Ryan could tell us something if he chose to do so." "But the point is, what could he tell us?" Gregson countered. "I don't know," the sheriff said. "Whatever rings that particular bell in my mind is so vague I can't put my finger on it." Gregson was thoughtful as he viewed the late autumn scenery. "Still think the log chain is connected with Ward's disappearance?" "What else can I think?" Carter replied irritably. "It didn't get back to the farm by itself, and Mrs. Ward is positive her husband had it in his truck when he left that night." Carter felt certain that if he could discover how the log chain got back to the Ward farm, he would solve an important part of the mystery. The reason for the log chain's return, however, escaped the sheriff completely. Even had Ward been murdered by the man pretending to be stuck in the mud, what could the murderer hope to gain by bringing the chain back to the farm? During the next few weeks, Carter and his aides dug deep into Tommy Ward's background. But they learned little more than they had previously discovered. Ward's success on his rich farm was the talk of the countryside, and his happy marriage was discussed with equal enthusiasm. According to the couple's friends and neighbors, there had been no clouds of any kind on the Ward horizon. For lack of a better procedure, Carter started checking the regular visitors to the Ward farm. He soon discovered that while Tommy and Dorothy Ward were well known in Taylor County and apparently popular, their regular visitors were few indeed. Their most frequent company were John Anderson and Henry Schmitt. Anderson was a farmhand who worked near the Ward place, was about 30 and a handsome person, while Schmitt was a farmer in his middle 50s who lived in the Lenox community. The sheriff and Gregson visited Anderson first. He readily admitted going to the Ward farm frequently. "Tommy always insisted on my coming," he related. "And besides Tommy being such a good guy, Dorothy's an excellent cook. Why shouldn't I take advantage of their hospitality?" "No reason at all," Carter replied. "Except that it's odd that you are one of their few visitors." "And do you know why they didn't have much company?" Anderson returned. "It was because they weren't home long enough. Tommy and Dorothy were great gadabouts themselves." Carter's eyes narrowed as he studied Anderson's handsome face. "And do you still go over there since Tommy's disappeared?" he asked carefully. Anderson shook his head. Dorothy said. "I asked her if I could be of any help, and guess what she said?" "What did she say?" Carter asked curiously. "She told me," Anderson replied, flushing, "that I could best help her by staying away. She intimated that with Tommy gone, there might be some talk if she received male visitors. Naturally, I didn't go back after that." The sheriff was silent as he thought that over, then he asked, "I don't suppose you ever saw anything suspicious, something that might now be connected with what happened to Ward?" Anderson shook his head. "I never did see anything out of the way over there," he answered. "Just for the record," said Carter, "what were you doing on the night Tommy Ward disappeared?" The farmhand's brow wrinkled in deep thought. "I remember now," he said presently, "I left the place where I work about 7:30. It must have been midnight when I got back." "And just where were you then?" "Alone part of the time, with friends the other part," came the quick answer. Anderson obligingly gave Carter a list of names to check. And he started with the man's employer. The farmer quickly supported his hand's statement as to the time he had left home and returned. "Any particular reason for you to remember so clearly what happened that far back?" Carter questioned. "Yes, there is," the man replied. "John left in such a hurry that night he forgot to lock up the chickens. That meant I had to do it. And I had just gotten through about 8 o'clock when I heard those 2 shots." Instantly, Carter pounced on the man's statement. "You mean gunshots?" he inquired. "Could you tell the direction they were coming from?" The man hesitated. Finally, he spoke. "Maybe I'm imagining things on account of Tommy's being missing. But as I remember it, they came from the direction of Tommy's farm. I didn't think anything of it at the time." "Had the mysterious caller shot Tommy Ward after he had gotten him out of the house?" Carter said to the farmer. "Did John Anderson have time to get as far as the Ward farm when you heard those shots?" The man deliberated a second. "Yes. But you don't think John had anything to do with whatever happened to Tommy?" "There seems to have been opportunity," the sheriff said dryly. "And I can easily imagine a likely motive. Dorothy Ward, although older than your farmhand, is very attractive." "John's not of that stripe," the farmer replied quickly. "He's a good friend of Tommy's, but that's all." Under subsequent questioning, the farmer continued to cling to his belief in Anderson's complete innocence in the Ward case. Carter changed the line of his questioning and asked the man if he had seen the mysterious coupe reported by another farmer. However, Anderson's employer denied ever seeing such a vehicle. "I've seen a coupe around the Ward farm," he amended hastily. "But not a strange one. Furthermore, this coupe always drove up to Ward's own front door." "And who owns this particular coupe?" the sheriff asked quietly. "Henry Schmitt, a good friend of Tommy's," the farmer replied. "And a good friend of all of us around here. He buys and sells horses, and he's turned a good deal for most of the folks living in this community. A right friendly and honest man is Henry Schmitt." When it became certain that Anderson's employer could add nothing more, Carter and his aides left. Round and Jones were assigned to check the rest of Anderson's alibi, while Carter asked the still grieving woman whether or not she or her husband had fired any shots on the night of Ward's disappearance. "Thought maybe you might have killed a marauding cat, or something like that," Carter ventured. The woman looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook her head. "There wasn't any shooting that night, Sheriff," she replied. "Tommy did shoot off his gun a couple of times before that, along in September, but not since." "But maybe you heard some shots fired after your husband left," Carter persisted. The woman shook her head. "I didn't hear anything that even sounded like shots that night," she declared. "But I can show you where the bullets hit the time Tommy fired his gun." Mrs. Ward took the 2 men to the front porch and pointed to a spot on the wall. "Tommy fired 2 shots, Sheriff, and there they are." She went on to relate that her husband had been attempting to kill a bat he found clinging there. But the bat had gotten away. "What about the gun? May we see it?" Carter asked. The woman nodded and fetched a .22 caliber rifle to the porch. During this time, Gregson had dug 2 small leaden pellets out of the wall. He knew, from vast experience, that these slugs had been fired from a .22 caliber rifle. Carter and Gregson examined Ward's rifle carefully. The weapon was well cleaned and oiled, and if it had been fired on the night of November 4th, there was no trace of it now. The sheriff thought of the coupe in the lane. He asked her if she had ever seen it. Mrs. Ward nodded her head. "I tried to get Tommy to do something about it, but he wouldn't. Said he didn't see any harm in people parking there." "What about you?" asked the sheriff. "Why didn't you go out and chase the coupe away?" "I never got close enough," Mrs. Ward reported. "The cars always left before I got there. I finally gave it up. It was like Tommy said. There didn't seem to be any harm in letting folks park there." "Maybe both of you were right, at one time," Carter said. "But I've a hunch that parked coupe has something to do with what's happened to your husband. And I think you'll live to regret the day you didn't prohibit its parking in your lane." Mrs. Ward's face was shadowed with grief and worry. Her beauty, the sheriff noted, was rapidly vanishing before the onslaught of her anxiety. She was fast becoming haggard and was now looking very much her age. The sheriff and Gregson drove back to town. There, Deputy Round told them that John Anderson's alibi had checked out closely. He had arrived in Bedford within a few minutes of leaving his employer's farm and would have had little time to have stopped en route to do any shooting or to have called Tommy Ward out on a fake accident plea. With Anderson completely exonerated, Carter and Gregson went to see Henry Schmitt at his home near Lenox. They found the huge, deep-chested horse-trader living on an estate as prosperous as the Ward farm. Like Ward, Schmitt was a well-respected member of his community. He served on the school board and was a leader in all civic enterprises. He was the father of a large family and a devoted husband to his wife. He readily answered the sheriff's and Gregson's questions about Tommy Ward. His picture of the missing man and his family was the same as they had received all the way down the line. "When did you last see Ward?" Carter asked the horse trader. Schmitt was thoughtful. After a moment, he answered, "I saw him on November 4th. I think that was the day he left home and never returned. Isn't it? I stopped at Tommy's place about 5 o'clock. He was okay then, and I didn't notice anything suspicious." "And what time did you get home?" the sheriff inquired. "About 6, Schmitt replied. "But if it's an alibi you're wanting, I can tell you I went to a school board meeting at 8 o'clock. I got home a little before midnight." Carter nodded. "We're checking all of Ward's friends. Matter of routine, you know." A later quick check of Schmidt's statement proved he was speaking the truth. And here, from all outer appearances, the investigation seemed to bog down. But the sheriff and his deputy, Lay Round, hadn't ceased plugging away on the case at all. They merely started to work undercover in hopes of lulling the guilty party's suspicions sufficiently for him or for them, in case more than one person was involved, to make a slip which would trap them. Carter and Round frequently discussed the mysterious case. And one day Round said, "Dorothy Ward's certainly slipping since Tommy disappeared. She looks 10 years older." "I've noticed that," Carter remarked. "And I'm wondering if that is due to grief and worry, or to something else." "What else?" Round countered. "That infernal log chain, for one thing," Carter said. "How could anyone return that without her knowledge? And another thing, those shots Anderson's employer heard. He's too experienced a man with guns not to know the difference between gunshots and backfiring. And then there's Mrs. Ward's statement that she heard no shots at all that night. Somebody's lying, either her or the farmer." "But how are you going to figure out which one?" Round asked. "I don't know yet," Carter replied. "And then there's the stuff about that coupe. Seems strange to me that Dorothy Ward couldn't slip up on those couples parked in their lane before they had time to get away." "You mean you think Dorothy Ward is lying about that and that she might have been meeting someone in the lane?" Round asked. "It's worth checking, isn't it?" Carter said shortly. "I'm only guessing, but shots in the dark are all we've got in this case. The coupe angle bothers me too. I don't know how everything connects up, but we can try and fit it together." "Henry Schmitt's the only person we've talked to who owns a coupe," Round said. "But he admits going to the Ward place and everyone says he was Tommy's friend." "I'm more worried about Dorothy Ward losing her good looks than I am about Henry Schmitt's owning a coupe," Carter replied. "But I want to keep an eye on both of them, especially Mrs. Ward." Several months later, Deputy Round came into Carter's office with something like satisfaction written across his face. "Well, you can quit worrying about Dorothy Ward," he announced. "You mean you've found Tommy?" Carter asked, incredulous. "Nothing like that. I mean Dorothy's being well taken care of. Somebody's looking after her, but good." "And who is the fairy godmother?" "Godfather," Round corrected him. "And it's our old friend, Henry Schmitt. His coupe has been seen parked at the Ward home, as usual, even though Tommy is gone. That is when Dorothy is at home. She seems to be away a lot, off on long trips." "Alone on long trips?" Carter asked. "Nobody knows. Maybe Schmitt is squiring her around parts unknown." Carter felt jolted. Henry Schmitt was a substantial citizen. Had he taken advantage of Ward's absence to make love to the attractive Mrs. Ward? "You'd better make certain about this before you go any further," he warned the deputy. We don't want Schmitt suing us for defamation of character." The deputy agreed. "I'll look into the matter a little deeper," he said. Accordingly, Round probed the angle further and learned it was common knowledge that Mrs. Ward and Schmitt were very friendly and had been seen together frequently. But all this was since Ward's disappearance. Both Round and Carter felt that there was nothing in this to connect the man with Ward's disappearance. Schmidt's wife would be the only one who could rightfully raise a stir about their being together. But Round kept digging, not only on this angle, but on several others, all revolving around the attractive Mrs. Ward. If Schmitt had been attracted to her, it was reasonable to suppose that other men had been also. But as the sheriff and his deputy probed around, they learned a curious thing. Since her husband's mysterious disappearance, Mrs. Ward had shunned all men except the elderly Henry Schmitt. They not only had John Anderson's word for this, but the word of several others as well. "Keep a night and day watch on Dorothy Ward's movements," Carter ordered his deputy. "If she knows anything she hasn't told us, she'll make a slip sooner or later." Carter's prophecy was soon to come true. For Deputy Round turned up the information that Mrs. Ward had been seen with Henry Schmitt on several occasions prior to her husband's vanishing act. He learned also that Mrs. Ward had not only approached a parked car in the lane, even as she had stated, but had gotten into the car, a black coupe. She had repeated this performance on numerous occasions, Round's informant declared. Was Henry Schmitt the man she had been meeting in the Lover's Lane? Carter and Round both felt that he was. And they were now convinced that it was Schmidt's coupe which had been trailing Ward's pickup truck on the night of November 4, 1943. Carter quickly called Agent Gregson back to Bedford and brought him up to date on the facts. Gregson agreed with Carter and Round that Schmitt should be investigated most thoroughly and watched both day and night. As the three men discussed the bizarre case, Round said, "And it would seem to me that with all the attention Dorothy is getting from Schmitt, she ought to be regaining her beauty. Instead, she looks worse all the time." Gregson and Carter both agreed that this looked strange and wondered. Was it her conscience that was putting wrinkles in her pretty face, or was some person keeping her in anxiety and suspense, possibly with threats? The three men kept a double check on Henry Schmitt. They received further corroboration of Dorothy Ward's meetings with the coupe in the lane when another informant stated emphatically that the occupant of the coupe was Henry Schmitt. They had a signal between them, this man explained. If Tommy was not at home, Dorothy would hang a white cloth on a clothes wire back of the house. Soon after the cloth appeared on the wire, she would go across the field and down to the lane. If there wasn't a cloth on the line, then she wouldn't come down, and Schmitt would back the car out and go away. "Did Tommy Ward ever hear about this?" Carter asked sternly. The man shook his head. "I don't know, except if he did, he would have stopped it, wouldn't he?" The man's statement was logical to the sheriff. Perhaps when Tommy had gotten around to trying to stop it was when he had disappeared. But, the officers agreed ruefully, how could they prove anything without a clue to the whereabouts of Tommy Ward or his body? Could they establish the fact that murder had been done without the corpus delicti? "The way I got it figured," Carter said in one of their numerous discussions, "Mrs. Ward is worried about something more than her husband's continued absence. Looks to me like she is worried about her own skin. Now if we could only get her to open up and explain about the log chain, the shots in the dark, and a few other things." "You mean she might be afraid of Henry Schmitt?" Gregson questioned, and when Carter nodded, the state agent continued, "In that case, we've got to make her more afraid of the state than she is of Schmitt. I move we start asking her questions and don't let up until she does some talking." Carter agreed to this plan. The three officers made repeated visits to the Ward home, asked pointed questions about the log chain, the shots Anderson's employer had heard, and finally about the coupe in the lane and about Henry Schmitt. After each visit, the sheriff could see that the woman's resistance had been worn down a little more. And finally, the strategy bore the fruit the investigators had hoped for. Mrs. Ward began her statement by saying she was afraid Henry Schmitt would kill her, her mother, and her son. "And it's because you know too much, isn't that it?" Carter queried. She jerked her head vigorously in the affirmative. "It's because I know he killed Tommy, shot him twice in the back with a pistol and a rifle." "Then the story about the stalled motorist was just so much hokum?" Carter asked gently. The distraught woman nodded. "Henry thought it all up," she said. "But he forgot to put the log chain in the back of the pickup truck. Otherwise, you wouldn't have found it in the barn." "Why don't you tell us the whole story, from the beginning?" Carter asked her. "You've just about put the whole story together with your investigation," she said in a dull voice. "Henry came by about 5 that evening, just like he said. But he didn't go home as soon as he stated. Instead, he stuck around until Tommy got to the house. When Tommy went out to feed the stock, he followed him. I had a feeling then that Henry was going to kill Tommy, so I got our rifle and hurried after him. Before I got outside I heard a shot. Then I saw Tommy. He was lying on the ground halfway between the corn crib and the barn. He was still alive for he was moaning loud. I screamed and went after Henry. I tried to hit him with the rifle but he was too strong. He took it from me and shot Tommy again. Then he threatened to kill me if I told the truth. He said I was in it as deep as he was and that if he didn't get me, the law would. "And what happened to your husband's body?" asked Carter. "We buried it in a field on the farm. But Henry wasn't satisfied with that, so he forced me to help him dig it up and bury it again on his son's farm near Lenox. He told me after that he had dug it up again and threw it into the Mississippi near Keokuk." "And I suppose Schmitt killed your husband because he was in love with you?" Carter probed. The woman nodded. "That's right. He forced his attentions upon me, and I was afraid he'd kill me, my son, and my mother if I didn't string along with him." Then she described how Schmitt, with the gun in his hand, had forced her to drive with him on long trips. He had even forced her, the sheriff learned, to accept a large payment on a fur coat which the woman coveted. He had forced other luxuries upon her and the frequent trips out of town. Mrs. Ward readily signed her confession. Schmitt was taken into custody at once and faced with the woman's statement. The elderly horse trader made a confession, too, but he declared that Mrs. Ward had fired the first shot into her husband's body. During the next few days, Carter, Gregson, Round, and Jones escorted Schmitt to various points about the country in an effort to find Tommy Ward's body or clues that would point to where it had been. But they found nothing. Schmitt maintained that he had heaved it into the river at Keokuk. He was sentenced upon a plea of guilty a few days later, on March 30, 1946, and was sentenced to 99 years in the penitentiary for his crime. On April 6, Mrs. Ward was indicted for first-degree murder, and on Thursday, April 25, she entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder and was given a 45-year sentence. She was taken immediately to the Women's Reformatory at Rockwell City, Iowa, where she is now serving out her sentence. Thus, even without his body to establish the fact of murder, Tommy Ward's violent death was ultimately avenged. The end.